session. But Carlijn, being the keynote speaker, you get the special honor of having a keynote, and then we have a question answer just to find out what you know.
Right. Big pressure. Because every time I share the stage or have the opportunity to speak to Carrie, I'm always reminded that I am not an expert on the thing that most of you are an expert on. So you can probably definitely teach me a lot there, and you can probably also really undermine me with your question, which I hope you won't. I think I am an expert on something many of you are not an expert on, though, which is actually the role that Africa can play in getting to that sustainable future that Carrie spoke about. So she asked me to speak quite broadly. I'll get to storage, I'll get to removal towards the end of my story, but I'll start with more of a vision and an overview. And usually at this stage of a presentation, you ask people to put away their phones and laptops. I ask you to get them out. Because I'm going to ask you, take your phone, take your laptop, open a browser window, and search for the words climate action, and put your results on image. Please do that. Climate action, and scroll through the image results you get. And when you've done that, and when you have a bit of an impression of what that yields, I invite you to search towards Climate Action Africa and scan through the image results again. And I'm going to ask a room of scientists a very difficult question to answer. In broad strokes, what differences do you see when you compare those two search results? So the image results of searching climate action and the image results of searching Climate Action Africa. What do you see? I see a bit of a response there.
It's different, actually.
It's different. How is it different?
Yeah, when I search climate action, something seems to be really going on. It's really optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
When I check Africa, it's not the case. Actually, I see the problems.
Correct. Yeah, I don't know if everybody heard that, but he said when I search climate action, I see something optimistic. You can see it in the colors, you can see it in the ideas that come up. And when I search Climate Action Africa, I see nothing but problems. You see emaciated people, you see scorched earth. Was that the impression that many of you had? And that's actually the dominant narrative when it comes to climate and Africa, because most people think of Africa as a hapless climate victim. The continent did very little to cause climate change, which is absolutely true. It caused historically about 3 to 4% of cumulative emissions. It's bearing the brunt of the results. Some of the biggest changes in climate and weather are being experienced in Africa. And it's the continent with the least buffer to deal with that. So the results or the impact hits hardest. And then on top of all of that, typically people think growth and living within planetary boundaries are incompatible. So the traditional industrialization and growth path that many African countries are keen to embark on is closed off to them. The world just doesn't have the climate budget, the carbon budget for it anymore. Providers of finance increasingly are turning away from traditional sort of oil and gas and associated infrastructure. There's a risk of stranded assets. So that kind of leaves Africa sit and wait, try not to die, while the rest of the world solves the climate problem. And this picture kind of illustrates why preventing a climate catastrophe and realizing growth are assumed to be irreconcilable. Because traditionally, so on the vertical axis, we've got GDP per capita. On the horizontal axis, we've got emissions per capita. And traditionally, the growth path is to the right and above. As your income grows, so do your emissions. And when you follow individual countries, some manage to curb back up to the left, but many of that do by shifting their economy to being more of a service economy and actually kind of offshoring the emissions that are associated with their consumption. And almost all African countries sit in that blob close to the origin. I have a version of this picture that has the names, so you can't read anything because it's all sort of superimposed. So that's not a very pretty picture. It's not a very pretty picture economically, it's not a very pretty picture morally. And it's not very feasible to say to right now 1.2 billion people, in 2050 2.5 billion people, stay poor. It doesn't have to be that way. We at CAPE believe in a concept called climate positive growth. And the math is incredibly simple. What you see here is just a conceptual picture of our global emissions. We all know, where's the pointer? Oh, that's not the pointer. Uh-oh. There we go, there's the pointer. It's green, that's amazing. We all know there's a number of countries that have not committed to 2050 being net zero. So by 2050, they'll have emissions. We also know that almost all countries that have committed to 2050 are off track. So they will also still have emissions by 2050. So we're likely to have a lot of emissions still by 2050. And almost all scientists tell us that that is catastrophic for human civilization as we know it. So the math is really simple. We're only going to get to global net zero if there's some countries that are massively net negative. And we state that most sub-Saharan African countries have the technical and economic potential to do just that, and do it as an economic sector, not as a service to humanity, but as a set of activities that they get paid for and can generate jobs with. So what does that look like? It is a very busy slide. Sorry, I tried to de-word most of them, but this one's hard to de-word, so I'll talk you through it a bit. To get to net zero, we fundamentally need two things, very simply. We need to green everything we consume, so the embedded emissions of everything that we consume in goods and services and transport, etc., needs to go down. And we need to remove atmospheric carbon. It's that simple. And the technical feasibility and commercial viability of each of those activities tend to be driven by three things: renewable energy potential, labor force, and relevant natural resources, whether it's available land to restore and reforest and sort of restore mangroves and do natural carbon removal, whether it's the geological formations that allow you to mineralize carbon in storage, etc., etc. And if you have those assets, the pathways we see for African countries, which we call the climate positive growth pathways, first, low emissions consumption and production, onshoring and reshoring production for African consumption. So as Africa grows its consumption, not doing that with the same emission intensity as the rest of the world has, but taking advantage of the fact that there's very little legacy industrialization, with the exception of South Africa and a few other countries, and doing it green from the start. Most industrial processes now have a low emission alternative, like green steel, for example. Why build traditional steel mills? Why not build green steel if you're building new capacity from the start? And steel is an interesting example because about 40% of the new city dwellers in the world between now and 2050 will live in African cities. Let me repeat that number, 40%. And Africa's market share in the global steel production is 1%. And not for lack of iron ore, but for lack of steel processing capacity. So if you combine those two, you know that the demand for steel to build city infrastructure and everything associated will grow rapidly. If you do that in the same way as we have elsewhere in the world, that net negative contribution is not going to help. And frankly, you can kiss net zero goodbye. You can kiss net zero goodbye. Because Africa's population growing, even if you assume will, let's say, reduce emission intensity of our current industrial processes by 50%, it will still add 8 gigatons to global emissions by 2050 if we don't manage it differently. If you build that production capacity and onshore and reshore and do climate compliant agriculture, etc., anyways, you could also build it to be a global green manufacturing and industrial hub. So that's a second pathway. It's the same thing, but producing not just for African consumption, but for the world. And then the third lever is removing carbon and getting paid to do so. And that's obviously there, and in the producing for the world is where the scope of this forum and what we work on intersect. And what that then allows you to do, oh, I didn't know there was animation on this one, geez. What that then allows you to do is actually extend that horizontal axis that we just looked at to the left, to negative emissions, because everybody only always talks about getting to net zero. But the journey for most African countries is going to be to get to net negative ahead of 2050 and make the math work globally. So that first pathway that I talked about, the onshoring and reshoring production for African consumption, allows African countries hopefully to move up without going very far right. The second pathway, producing for the world, allows Africa to help other countries achieve their decarbonization targets. So other countries that are here can move to the left. And getting paid for removing carbon allows African countries to move up and to the left. That's the very basic thesis. And the really good news is that it's gaining some traction. And obviously that's sort of my universe. I don't know how familiar you are with that. But a couple of weeks ago, Kenya and the African Union organized the world's first Africa Climate Summit. And as a result of that, there was a Nairobi Declaration. And that sounds all very technical, but it was a huge diplomatic feat because all African Union countries, all of them, embrace this idea of climate positive growth as their development narrative. And that is huge, because many African countries are of the opinion that growth should come first, and right, you shouldn't tell us to reduce our emissions when you have screwed over the world and it's our time to grow right now, which is a very valid moral argument. What we're saying is it doesn't have to be either or. You can grow. Nobody should tell any African country they can't grow. You can grow by being part of the solution instead of adding to the problem. Also, a number of African countries are holding very strongly to this, to loss and damage, which obviously at last year's COP was agreed for the first time. There was a recognition of loss and damage. There was an agreement there be a loss and damage fund. And we're saying, you don't have to throw that away. Please don't hold your breath, because whether it gets paid is a big question. When it gets paid, it's probably not going to be enough to compensate for the loss and damage, let alone for achieving inclusive economic growth. So icing on the cake if you get your loss and damage, but let's actually drive agency with growth in Africa. So let me look at each of those three production factors for a bit, right? I said renewable energy potential, labor, and relevant natural resources, and then we'll look at each of the three pathways. And I didn't time this, so I hope I'm doing okay. As the world population ages, Africa has the youngest and fastest growing workforce. And what you see here to the right is the projections of the number of people in working age population for every person over 65 in 2050. And many people know these, the EU, Japan, the US. Not many people know this. Our factory of the world is aging like there's no tomorrow. Thankfully, there's a huge, huge labor force there, and this is just the example of Kenya. 8 people of working age population to every person over 65 in 2050. Africa will be 40% of the global workforce by 2100. Massive potential, also a massive issue, a massive risk. All of us here in Europe don't need to be reminded that migration that we're really struggling with is to a large degree driven by this, by lack of opportunity on the African continent. Africa needs to generate 30 million jobs every year. 30 million jobs every year to absorb its youth bulge. And if that doesn't happen, we've seen nothing yet in terms of migration or insecurity on the continent. I'll spend a bit more time on renewable energy. I was literally not able to join you on the welcome cocktail last night because we were hammering out the last bit of analysis, and I'm very proud to present that to you first today, and to this audience in particular, who are going to not let me get away with sweeping statements, and I'm probably going to interrogate every number I put in front of you. So really excited about that. At a very high level, not surprising to anybody, right? Africa has massive untapped renewable energy potential. 50 times the world's estimated electricity demand by 2040 is Africa's untapped renewable energy potential. Also not particularly surprising is that we're at a window in time where that is actually the smart economic choice. So if you're projecting out pathways of how to electrify the continent, because there's still 600 million Africans without access to electricity and 150 million without access to reliable electricity, you can actually provide energy access for all of those the cheapest by going renewable first. That is actually 30% cheaper than the current sort of anchor pathway, which is like a low emissions pathway for the African continent. But it does require 40% higher upfront investment. As we all know, renewables cost more upfront, and then sort of, when you operate them, they cost far less. Remember that number 40%, because we'll come back to that later. But not only is it high, it has really interesting seasonality. The graph you see here to the right-hand side is solar energy output at 3 top-performing sites in Germany, Kenya, and Spain over the course of a year. Germany and Spain have a winter. Kenya does not. And that's stating the obvious, but what that means is that the current technology around battery storage actually brings operating industry on renewables into view. And that is something that in Europe people don't think of, certainly not with solar. Hold your horses, I'll get to wind. I've not just sold a solar picture. But with solar, you tell anybody in Europe you can operate industry on solar, they're like, you're wacko, because it gets winter. Well, it doesn't in big parts of the world. So what we did is we said, let's put a hypothetical setup, particular standard PV setup with battery of 2 or 3 days of demand, and put that in those 3 spaces. So southern Spain, the best solar space in the world, in Europe. Germany, one of Europe's industrial pockets, and a good spot in Kenya. And compare, if you want 98% reliability, what that system can give you in those 3 spots. And all of this analysis is based on hourly data for 15 years. So it's got a pretty long data set that allows you to not have sort of 1 year's summer effects. So that same battery-powered system in Kenya will enable a reliable baseload that is 10 times what that system can give you in Germany, and 2.3 times what that system can give you in Spain. And it's kind of obvious when you think about it, because you've got more hours of sun, you've got higher sun intensity closer to the equator, and you don't really have a winter. But as we think about how we set up industry and invest in it, we in Europe tend not to think of this as an opportunity. If you look at it in a different way, so you say, okay, that same system, what's the maximum I can squeeze out of that system in Spain? If battery is not a constraint, if I can allow the battery to become as big as I want, which obviously not true, but just for the sake of the analysis, and then you get to a particular base load, what's the battery size you need to get that same base load equally reliably in Kenya? 1/100th of the battery size in Kenya from the battery size in Spain. Germany doesn't even get there. It doesn't get enough sun to ever, like you see that to the right, like it peters out. There's an asymptote at 45%. There's just not enough sun hours to get that amount of energy in a year out of that system. And I see some people taking pictures. The slides will be made available. There's a version with a little bit more text to some of the slides, so it's easier to read. And we're always available to share any discussions or any data, or, you know, like, we want to share all of this with everybody. Now you can say, okay, fine, right? You pick the picture you want to pick, because it's sunny in Africa, we get that. But it's windy in Europe, right? That's fair. And what you see here on the bottom, so the top graph is the same graph you saw earlier, but now sort of squeezed, so I can put a second graph on the same page. Kenya is beaten by Spain and Germany when it comes to wind. So maybe when we optimize for wind and solar, Kenya is not the best place to put industry powered by renewables. What we did was run an analysis based on the current cost data of CapEx of installing solar, installing wind, and installing grid-level battery, and optimizing what the cheapest system is to get the same level of baseload reliably, and compare that in the 3 locations. Comparing Kenya and Germany leaves you with a German system that is 3 times as expensive as the Kenya system, twice the battery size, thrice the total capacity. So what you see here are the design metrics. So obviously when you design something like that, there's a question, how big do I make the total system, right? What's the capacity I install as a percentage of baseload that I want to get out of it? What's my balance between wind and solar? Because those are the 2 sources we have in the analysis. And what's the battery size? And because we have costs for all of them, the objective function we minimize over is the costs. So what you get here is, in Germany, that system will be 55% wind, 45% solar. I was a bit surprised by that. I had thought it was higher on wind, but solar still is about a third cheaper to install than wind right now. So once you get to bigger sizes, it makes sense to put some solar in there, even in Europe. 16 times the total size, 16 times the base load is the size you need in Germany to get the sweet spot in terms of cost. Now, granted, I'm only looking at what you need to meet that base load. Obviously, a system that is 16 times versus a system that's 5.8 times a given base load, it also has a lot of power that is not as reliable, that isn't available 98% of the time, but maybe 50% of the time in summer. So the German system still has more surplus intermittent energy that you can also use, but we all know how much more valuable baseload is when you do industrial planning. So this is a baseload analysis. So you're seeing here costs indexed on Germany. Kenya is about a third of that cost. Okay, fine, Germany. What about Spain? Spain is better, but is still 50% more expensive than Kenya. So again, what we did here was find the cheapest possible solar, wind, and battery system that can give a 98% reliable baseload based on hourly data for 15 years. And not just on solar, which I showed earlier, which is kind of a cheap win for Africa, but even if we take wind into account, Africa is the better place to do this. And not just from a biophysical perspective, but we all know how freaking long it takes to get permits and to do planning in many parts of super densely populated Europe. Many parts of Africa think of that differently, have more space, think of this as more of a driver of their economy, still need to make their laws in some cases, which is both tricky for an investor, but also an opportunity because you can actually shape it to accelerate renewable potential. So what can you put that? So we looked at if you remember that slide with the 3 assets and the 3 pathways. So we looked at 2 of the assets. We looked at the demographics and the energy. On the natural resources and assets, I realized I don't have a slide, but I have the numbers in my head. 2/3 of the remaining unused arable land in the world are in Africa. 30% of the global deposits for critical minerals are in Africa. Africa already produces 1/4 of the global bauxite production, and that's not even tapping all of its potential, and. Has a lot of natural and mineral assets and potential. And a lot of it actually is unknown, which is a big problem. And we'll get to that when I get to sort of what it takes, and that's hopefully where some of you come in terms of closing some of that data gap. So let's look at a few things that you can do with all of that power, the people, and the renewable, and the land availability. Green hydrogen production potential. When you look at maps for green hydrogen, usually Africa is a white space. It shouldn't be, it doesn't have to be, it has the power, it has the space. What you see here is a geospatial mapping of all locations, and particularly the coastal ones are actually really interesting, the blue, because those are locations where there's sufficient land availability, so there aren't actually cities and other kind of infrastructure. There's no protected parks, etc. We're not concreting over every piece of land in Africa. It's no more than 20 kilometers inland. It's no more than 100 meters of elevation from the coast. Because those things, and particularly the elevation, mean that the additional energy to use seawater for green hydrogen production is kept at less than 5% of the total hydrogen production. So lots of people often say, oh, desalinating water takes so much energy. That's true, but it's only a fraction, actually 0.2% of the energy you need to make hydrogen with electrolysis. So lots of people are scoping, and all the green you see here is the places that have enough sweet water to do this. But we know that water is going to be a scarce resource. So let's look at actually places where you can use seawater to make green hydrogen. And we all know green hydrogen is a precursor to so many things, right? It's an energy carrier in and of itself. It's going to enable green steel. It's going to enable green plastics, synthetic fuels, Over 20 countries in Africa have potential for that green hydrogen production. Anybody who wants to see this on a 1 by 1 kilometer grid, you're welcome to ask me, and I'll ask our GIS colleagues to share that with you, because there's really, really detailed information there. So I spoke about bauxite already. Africa mines a quarter of the global bauxite production, 98% of which is exported as bauxite. Not as aluminium, as bauxite. And aluminium production process is an entirely electricity-driven process, has been forever. There's no process innovation if you want to run that on power. It is a power and electricity-driven process. If we were to smelt all of Africa's mined bauxite locally using new renewable energy, we would save 335 million tons of CO2 of emissions, 1% of global emissions. We would generate 280,000 new jobs, tap into $37 billion of additional revenue for Africa, and very importantly, require, and this is where Africa's story is different from the rest of the world, require 44 gigawatts of anchor demand. It's not different in that it takes less power or more power in Africa. That's not the difference. The difference is that additional energy demand is a good thing in Africa. Because Africa suffers from a really weird paradox, this massive untapped renewable energy potential that I spoke about, 600 million people without energy access, so huge energy poverty, and high energy prices. And lots of people who work in international development, which is where my background immediately prior to CAPE sits, argue that we should focus on retail access first. It's a travesty to put up bauxite smelters if there's 600 million people without energy access. We should put in mini-grids and microgrids and this, that, and the other. The thing is, why hasn't that happened? That opportunity has existed forever. Hasn't happened because it's not economically viable. The world over, retail connections are subsidized, and particularly rural and far-out retail connections are subsidized. That's the world over. That's for populations that can pay for power. Populations that struggle to pay for power need even more of a cross-subsidy. That cross-subsidy needs to come from industrial demand, from city demand, from urban demand, and from healthier balance sheets of utilities, which African utilities don't have. A bauxite smelter that's exporting aluminum to the EU can much more easily secure the funding for an investor in the renewable energy investment. Because investors in renewable energy say, where's the anchor demand? And can we please have that be long-term? And can we have clarity on the price? And can it be somebody that I can chase when they don't buy it? And can it please be in 4x? And people that think about placing industry in different locations say, how do I know that I'm going to have power reliably, affordably over a long period of time? So instead of thinking of those two separately, they need to be thought of in conjunction. And then actually industrial anchor demand is the engine that will set Africa on a growth path. Similar story for iron ore. I think I may be running out of time, so I'll skip through some of these, but I can very much talk to you about that later. There's obviously a huge coming demand for sustainable maritime fuel now that the EU ETS has agreed to put maritime fuel into the ETS stepwise and actually not giving emission allowances from the get-go. That can drive CCUS, biogenic fuel synthesis, and again, sort of, super energy intense process, making green hydrogen first, combining it with a stream of CO2, which can be from cement or biogenic. I mean, there's not a lot of point source CO2 on the African continent on average. We probably all know about the Sasol factory in South Africa, which is the exception to the rule, but in general, most African countries have very low levels of industrialization. So you're looking probably more at biogenic or sources of CO2 from other locations, like as we're talking about here in the next couple of days. Last bit, removals, which is where I'm getting closer to what we're talking about here. I don't need to tell you this, but we need it to counter emissions from countries that aim for net zero after 2060. We need it to counter emissions from hard-to-abate sectors. And we need it to reverse global warming and undo the damage, which is the hopeful picture that people hardly ever talk about. And we need it in massive amounts, 5 to 16 gigatons a year by 2050, according to IPCC, if we do our very best on reducing emissions. If we don't do our very best on reducing emissions, that number is going to be much bigger. I also don't need to tell you this, but I just want to set the context. There's different types of removal, nature-based, engineered, and hybrid methods. Usually, just like with in general, where I started the conversation, people think of Africa as that, the safari of carbon removal, planting forests, not cutting them down. We argue Africa has a lot of potential for hybrid and engineered removal as well. I'm going to skip over this because I've spoken to most of it already. Just looking at the nature-based, very, very sizable opportunities. If you had carbon as the only thing to pay for that, and your carbon price long-term was around the $50 a ton, which is a pipe dream in the voluntary markets, but far below what most compliance markets rank at right now. Africa has the potential to generate up to $15 billion in annual revenue from nature-based removal alone, and very importantly, positively impact up to 86 million people with improved livelihoods and jobs. So that's the nature. We shouldn't forget about the nature, but that's not what we're here for. We also shouldn't forget about some of the hybrid solutions. So enhanced rock weathering, for example, is a really exciting and rapidly growing opportunity, and we're working with a company called Undo, a Scottish company, and we've run their Kenya pilot, and they found that Kenya has some of the fastest weathering basalt. That's just sheer luck. But Kenya also has millions of smallholder farmers who can't afford fertilizer and lime, and therefore can't really fight degradation of their land. And the beauty of adding basalt is that it actually adds or helps with the retention of nutrients. It helps reduce soil acidity and therefore increases crop yields up to 40%, depending on the crop and the microclimate, etc. But 40% is what Undo has achieved in some locations. So we're working with them, seeing what we can get in African countries. They've also worked in Tanzania. Here are some stats of why that is relevant. The reason I wanted to sort of quickly brush through that is to show that for many of these solutions, whether it's industrial or hybrid removal, Africa has the potential to have really exciting co-benefits, and therefore sort of, have a double-edged sword in terms of climate benefit, economic growth, solving socioeconomic problems, which hopefully, as we start pricing all externalities into the future, can also attract the higher prices and the more premium demand. That's a big if. I'll get to that big if. Engineered removal. Now I'm beginning to touch on what you all focus on and know a lot about. Kenya is incredibly suitable for DAC and for mineralized storage. And I've spotted Sandra in the audience. We've been in conversations about this for a while. Super excited to catch up on that. Actually, the geothermal energy potential here, the 1 gigawatt, is just what's known and already scoped out, but it's probably a multiple of that. Most people think it's more in the 10 to 20 gigawatt of untapped potential for Kenya alone. Kenya also doesn't use it's already a big geothermal player, actually in the top 5 in the world in terms of installed capacity. It doesn't use its heat at all, just pumps the brine back in at 160 degrees, which is kind of like, for us Europeans, like, wait, what? You can do so much with that. And one of the things you can do with that is actually run Climeworks' process and scrub CO2 from the air, or various other ones that use waste heat as a source of energy in their process. So just last week at the New York Climate Week, Climeworks and a company called Great Carbon Valley, which is a commercial entity that focuses on the same idea of climate positive growth that CAPE focuses on, agreed and committed to the Kenyan government to drive a large-scale DAX deployment in Kenya. And there's some real tangible next steps that are agreed in terms of scoping and pilot, et cetera, starting operations by 2028. And that's a massive shift away from how most people, again, go back to the very first minutes of when I spoke, when you were all looking at those pictures. That's not what people think of Africa about. Even Bill Gates, in his breakthrough book, says, well, all those like complex nascent technologies, let's not bother Africa with those. Let's mature them first elsewhere in the world, and then when sort of we've ironed out all the kinks, maybe we can get them to these locations. We're ironing out the kinks anyways. Let's iron them out in the locations that have actually the best biophysical potential and the best intrinsics to be cost competitive at this, and not be competing for energy demand for something else. Because these are all hugely energy intense processes. You know that, we know that. It's a big part of the pushback against what we all do. Because if you are operating in an economy where there's very, very high industrial emissions, the next bit of renewable energy that you bring online should go towards taking that coal-fired power plant offline. You get a lot of pushback if you want to put DAC or a big data center as an energy sucker. Guess what? In Africa, that's exactly what we need to build out the renewable energy potential. So that moral hazard that you have around where you use the renewable energy does not exist in the same way. So let's please actually look at that and drive that. What path can it set Africa on? And I have to make a caveat here before you start evangelizing these numbers, which I hope you will. I hope you're inspired by the opportunity in the story. The numbers you see here aren't just like, if you add up everything that you can do in climate positive growth, you get automatically these numbers. This is projecting out where Africa could go as a continent of upper middle income status with a share of global economy and global production that's commensurate with its labor force. So sort of 25% of global production, et cetera. So climate positive growth can set this in motion, but it doesn't automatically deliver these results. But these results are staggering. If we do this, we can avoid those almost 8 gigatons of additional emissions that I spoke about earlier, can reduce global emissions by over 11 gigatons, can grow the carbon budget for the world, the cumulative carbon budget that's left, by about 40%, can grow African GDP tenfold, can unlock those 30 million jobs a year for Africans that we need so desperately. And I'm not asking you to care about Africa, but sprinkled through, hopefully you've seen that Africa can help solve a lot of the problems, not only in climate and in greening industrialization, in diversifying supply chains and making sure there's less dependency on one actor. I would also not suggest you all shift that all from the one actor you have now to DRC. You should diversify it. But many African locations offer that opportunity, and the geopolitical advantages and the stemming of migration and all of those things that actually cause real political tension in many of our European home countries. I don't need to tell you this, right? If we don't do it, we're screwed. But it's hard. It's hard. And what we're lacking is 3 things. And I wish I could have made this picture bigger, this one. This is bless them. I'll also tell them what they've done really well since then. But this is the 2021 map. I think based on RMI, I was searching for the RMI one. I think ultimately this is a different source of green hydrogen potential. Since then, Africa has been collared in by a number of actors, but this, when I was at COP 2 years ago, this was up on the screen for 45 minutes on a discussion on green hydrogen. And at the beginning of the discussion, somebody had said, yeah, we just don't know how much potential there is in Africa. But what does an audience remember when that picture is up for 45 minutes on a screen? It's not, oh, we need to go figure out what's possible in Africa. It's let's forget about Africa. We've got the rest of the world. So we really, 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 really need to close that data gap. We need to put Africa's potential on the map. And when it comes to storage, for example, I'm really jealous of the work that you guys have done, bringing together all of the national geological surveys, et cetera, and looking at what the cumulative storage potential is in Europe, because none of that exists in Africa. So those companies that have announced the DAC effort will also have to suss out what the potential, the size, the quality, et cetera, of the storage is, because they have no shoulders to stand on. And that's a problem. And the competitive potential and opportunity that Africa has is a closing window. So if we don't actually focus our attention on understanding this, the world will move on. The world will or will not solve the problem by Global North solutions, but Africa will definitely be left out. The second is access to markets. It doesn't make any sense to be the best possible location to produce green steel, green aluminum, high quality, high integrity carbon removal credits if you can't actually access the markets. And currently, no compliance system other than corners of Corsia accepts African carbon credits. So African carbon credits are sold on the voluntary market. If you're really lucky, you might strike $20 a ton. It's probably more in the $3 to $5 range. There's no way you can do high quality, high integrity, good community engagement, good MRV. All of that criticism is correct. Many of those credits aren't good, but give me a break. You can't get them right for $5 a ton. That's not the price for these kind of activities. So as we think about the future of compliance markets, how can increased quality and integrity and reliability and market access go hand in hand? And how can we actually make sure that these solutions can compete fairly and equitably? And the same is true for the products. I love CBAM, and I'm a bit of an outsider in this community. Lots of people are very worried that CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism of the European Union, will hit African exports, and frankly, it will. Those tiny little, that 2% of bauxite that gets exported as aluminium is actually really high emission and should be hurt by CBAM. It's the 98% that could be processed on the continent that would have access to the European Union without paying extra taxes in CBAM. That's the really exciting bit. But whether the details of CBAM will be, the exact metrics and the mechanisms and the payments and the systems and what data and what baseline you need, whether that will be designed in a way that Africa has access is anybody's guess. But we know that African voices are not at the table when it's designed. So if it does get designed in a way that gives it access, it's a stroke of sheer luck, which I don't think is very likely. And then the last thing we need is suitable investment. Again, it doesn't make a ton of sense to be the best biophysical location if you're paying 5 to 8 times the cost of capital as elsewhere. 5 to 8 times. Because you have to be pretty damn good to beat that, right? The numbers that I showed for Germany and Kenya might get us there. You definitely don't beat Spain anymore with that difference in cost of capital. And some of that is driven by real underlying risk that we need some smart de-risking mechanisms for. And those of you who may have followed the discussions in Paris and at the New York Climate Week, the Forex instrument that Avinash Prasad from the Bridgetown Initiative has suggested is a really, really good mechanism to do that. A lot of it is perceived risk. When there is a coup in Niger, investors in Ethiopia are struggling to attract money. You know how far they are from one another? You know how disconnected they are? But it's all Africa. So something happens in what admittedly is a very unstable part of the continent right now, West Africa, and East Africa, which has the potential to be a huge green industrial hub and is on track to do that, immediately is hit by it. The war in Europe has driven a lot of African countries to the brink of debt distress. Kenya pays 60% of its tax revenue in debt service. 60%. Nigeria pays over 80% of its tax revenue in debt service. That's not a basis to develop a country. And these things, as exciting private sector investment opportunities as they offer, will also need a collaborating government and some sort of public infrastructure, which you cannot build when you're paying 80% of your tax revenue in debt service. And that's not just Nigeria's fault for taking on so much debt. It's not exactly their fault that the global interest rate grew by a factor of 10 in the past couple of years on their bonds. So lots of work. Hopefully over the next couple of days I can exchange some ideas with you around some of closing the data gaps, which I hope we have some really cool ideas on in the room. I'm available at any time now or later to share any further information on this, share this data, have it be challenged. We are working at the cutting edge of some of this analysis. We're one of the only actors doing this. So I would love to actually put some of our analyses up to the challenge of the people in this room, because we have to get them right, because we have to. This is not just a plea of like, please send some money to Africa. It's recognize the real economic and climate potential the continent has and invest in a truly smart way to solve the global climate problem. I have no idea how long I was, but nobody interrupted me, so there we go. Fantastic. That's it. Amazing.
So thank you very much, Carlijn. And I think this is a fantastic reminder that the climate solution doesn't have to look the same everywhere. So I thought this was wonderful, and you really brought some food for thought. And I'm now going to hand over to the audience for questions. Please introduce yourself as well.
Jasper de Reus from ETH. Thanks very much for the very interesting presentation. So there's a lot of investments happening. For instance, the Middle East, China is very active. So in your discussions with these players, what is the sentiment you get there? Are they also following the same train of thought?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very sensitive one geopolitically. You can count on the Dutch person to ask a sensitive geopolitically question. Many of those actors have a different risk calculus than most of the European and US actors. And many of them have a longer time horizon, have greater tolerance for some of the concerns they see. It's easier to get investment from China and the Middle East into Africa right now than it is from Europe and the US. And we'll take anything, right? African countries should also diversify their investor base, just like every investor should diversify its portfolio and every off-taker should diversify its supply chain. And actually, often when I'm in discussions, especially with European policymakers, they tend to be quite focused on the concessional capital that they may be able to avail through the EBRD or other DFIs. And they're usually quite surprised when I tell them the biggest thing you can do is just open your markets to solutions from Africa on the same fair and equitable terms. No preferential treatment, just no punitive measures either. And actually, not to be repeated outside of this room, but if I had to choose between getting some investment capital and some patient capital from Europe or getting access to the markets, I want both. But if I had to choose, access to markets would be the more important one right now.
Manfred Reber-Chomotsch, thank you very much for a very good broad overview. Of course, you have to take a technocratic view on that. You cannot do it otherwise.
Yeah.
But my intention is now to look at the governance in this issue. We have now good governance in Europe. It's always difficult to see how react on climate challenges. And for Africa, I think it's a little bit more difficult. And I don't know how we can come closer to this challenge, and because that's, as you said, if in Mali or Niger there are some problems, and then Ethiopia has a problem, and so for me that's a big difficulty for Africa to work with that. Thanks.
Absolutely, and I didn't intend to shy away from that, so I'm glad I'm getting the question. So there's a few things when it comes to policy and governance, and let me pass out the different aspects a little bit. The first is that, and that was that big win from the Africa Climate Summit that I spoke about, that Nairobi Declaration, is that it does not, when governments realize that climate and economic growth can go hand in hand and there's actual synergies, then you're taking away a lot of the challenge that you're, for example, seeing in Europe, right? Where, you know, when it starts costing a lot or where there's a lot of pushback, it's like, oh, let's water down some of it. So the governance questions around the specifics are different. And given that there are synergistic opportunities, if you can put this at the core of countries' economic development plans, that can get a lot of traction. I'll get to I won't skirt around the corruption and the safety and the instability question. I'll get there. The second thing I'll say to this, and that's often a really hard reality for people to reckon with, but it is very important that global partners, whether it's off-takers or investors or otherwise, work with African countries in a way that opens the opportunities early. And what I mean by that is, actually, I look at this room, I probably can't find a room of equally qualified and equally dedicated people, even just a third of that room, if I had every African focusing on this topic in this room. The quality of the talent is not the question, but the amount of it, the amount of government capacity. That I work with a number of national governments in Kenya, and they may have 1 or 2 people for a topic that an average European government has 4 departments for. So that means that if you want like detailed regulation on a particular topic, that's going to, developing that is coming at the expense of doing something else in their massive portfolio, because they have a shortage of capacity. Again, not necessarily a shortage of quality, but just bodies. And it's unrealistic to expect that they get everything right before we can start engaging in conversations about potentially buying stuff from them. So why would an African country prioritize detailed regulations around underground storage if there's zero pathway into selling carbon credits in compliance markets? It's not a good use of their time. So thinking about, and it's not that dissimilar from sort of, you know, access processes to new countries in the European Union, where kind of like you dangle the carrot, and with that there's a lot of focus on, okay, now we need to work on these 5 things that are conditions. I'm not saying lower the bar, but I'm saying open a window, create that perspective so that there is a reason for any reasonable policymaker that's deciding what to spend their very precious time on to focus on this and not that. Then the question of insecurity and corruption. It's a big question, and there's many parts of the African continent I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole right now. There's also many parts I would. There are many African countries that arguably are politically a lot more stable than the US is, and have been for a very long time. And yet, when I say that, I see a lot of people kind of like, you know, chuckle, some awkwardly, some sort of, you know, in full agreement. But is that ever a debate in investment in the US? Hardly ever. So what I'm calling for is, don't paint it with that really broad brush. And again, some of those questions around stability and corruption, etc., they are bigger issues for some investments over others. So investments that require a lot of capex sunk in a particular place, which is much of what we're discussing here, where you put billions dollars worth of installations, etc., in a place, and when it goes up in flames, you can't just pick it up and walk out. Sure, they need much more stability, and therefore they're more suitable for some locations than others. There's a reason I've taken a lot of numbers from Kenya for this presentation. but you're doing enhanced rock weathering. You take the rock dust from a quarry and you spread it on land. If that country goes up in flames next year, you go to another country. There's not billions of dollars worth of capex that you sunk in there. So it really, my plea is sort of, let's unpack and not look at it as that massive blob, that gray thing there that we never look at. Because it's 54 different countries and they have very different levels of stability, very different trajectories. And there's many of them that can compete in transparency and stability with the weaker parts of the global north. Which, yes, I said the US is the weaker part of the global north when it comes to stability. I did do that.
Thank you for this very honest answer. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you. My name is Randy from the Danish Energy Agency. I was just wondering, a bit concerned about the remark that in Africa it's much easier and faster to get permits. That was my conclusion from your remark. And in Europe, and why some of the reasons it's so difficult, it's not only the planning, it's also environmental aspects. And I was just wondering, how does the environment follow this? Because even mining of bauxite and production of aluminium causes a great harm to the groundwater, the drinking water. It's one of the major causes of soil pollution around the world, all kinds of mining. And even in Denmark, I know the public is very interested not only in reducing CO2 from our own atmosphere, but also globally. Mm-hmm. We don't want to produce batteries if we're going to cause pollution in Africa. Yep. So how does the environment come into this scenario, cost-wise and also time?
Yeah. So again, there's not one single answer for like the breadth of topics and the breadth of policy environments that I'm looking at, because you're asking me that question for 54 countries, which is really hard to answer. Many African countries have relatively strong environment protection, regulation and implementation. One of my favorite pictures is actually the picture, and I unfortunately didn't put it in this presentation, but the picture of the biggest geothermal installation in Kenya. It's in Hell's Gate Park, which is a national park. When you walk from one of the installations to the other, you have to be careful not to be run over by zebra. I kid you not. And that's obviously, geothermal lends itself to that, right? Because geothermal, a lot of the actual footprint in the installation is underground. But the fact that Kenya has been able to become one of the biggest geothermal energy producers in the world and do that in conjunction with maintaining and growing the revenue and upholding the conservation for that park says something about how they think about this. So it's on lots of government radar screens, it's on lots of people's radar screens, right? Let me go to that cliche of lots of people sort of, living off the land. Many more Africans live off the land and have a closer relation with land and climate than many of us. I don't know, I'm not a sociologist, but maybe that contributes to that stronger sort of policy environment, relatively stronger in that respect. Another aspect I would say on this is, it's a two-way street. If European or US car makers who have committed to shifting to green steel want to start buying that from Africa, okay, tell the African producers what they need to meet. And monitor that. You need to do that in the US and in Europe. Don't tell me that there's not companies that are trying to cut corners in the US and Europe. There's regulation and there's enforcement for a reason. Agree what the rules are. Say, if it doesn't meet these kind of rules around how you deal with the water, how you deal with local communities, etc., we're not buying from you. And check against that. And many of the African countries that are excited about bringing these industries are saying to both the off-takers and the industries, we may not have regulation in some of these parts just yet. As we develop it, we know what we want to take into account, but you tell us what you need to see. You tell us what kind of context you need to be able to operate in, and we could design it right in the first go. Is there a risk for potential exploitation? Absolutely. Could a really well-informed industrial player try and arm twist a low-capacity African government into getting lower rules? Sure. Is there a lot of historical precedent for that? Yes. Is that entirely on the African country? No. And with 30% of the critical minerals, global deposits of critical minerals in Africa, do you have an alternative? You'll need those materials. So let's indicate what you need them, how you need them to be mined, how you need that to be handled, and again, create that access to markets with fair prices. And it's in everybody's interest. It is not in African countries' population government interest to just pollute short term and then create completely degraded lands. But in many cases, why historically those situations have emerged is either because of a massive power imbalance that was abused, frankly, by the global north player that came in, or because the business case just didn't hold. It does cost money to do those things well.
Thank you. And I'd just like to share a little story that through a project, we had some public engagement around a local CO2 storage site, and we talked to them about kind of large-scale development of CCS in the UK.